Hello, personal health and wellness. Welcome to chapter 13. We are talking substance abuse and addiction. So, on the slides, the first thing we're going to do is define the term addiction. And I'm sure you're familiar with some form of a definition of addiction. And so, to kind of refine that, there are some key terms we want to include and we really want to pay attention to. And so, this is the persistent compulsive dependence on a behavior or a substance. So it's not always just the substance that comes in. Sometimes it's just simply a behavior. And one of the things that we've talked about since chapter 1 is behavior modification. And so that is a lot of what we're going to try to do with addiction and with those substances and with those behaviors as we progress through this chapter. It also says that there is a negative consequence associated with addiction. And I would submit to you this: I have an addiction to coffee, or more specifically caffeine. And so in the mornings when I wake up, I really cannot get anything off of my mind other than, can I get to that coffee? And if something stands in my way, I'm really persistent about going around that to get to my coffee, right? So you may have that same addiction. And if you do, chances are some of these things right here are going to really stick deep with you. So first of all, addiction causes cellular changes. This is something that science has proven to us, that our brain chemistry literally changes around an addiction. And so if that's the case, these next four items really make sense. First of all, there are symptoms of addiction. And the number one symptom that we see is compulsion. And that is an excessive preoccupation. That means it's all you can think about. And I myself become very hyper focused about things, but that has to do with some other things about my brain. This is compulsion in a very different way. Remember, we're talking about negative consequences are tied to this. And so I'm willing to do a lot of things to get to whatever that substance or behavior is that I have an addiction to. The number two thing is, though, loss of control. And I don't think I've ever had a loss of control over my coffee. I think there have been times where that's come close, right? And probably you have too, but never quite seen that loss of control. The third thing, and again, is there a negative consequence associated with me not having my coffee, or even worse, me having my coffee? And the answer to that is no. I think I'm very well in control. But there are some people who have such a addiction to a substance or behavior that that loss of control and those negative consequences are very real, and they happen very frequently. And then the fourth and final symptom is simply denial. And that is when you ask that person about this situation, they're going to say it's not a problem. They have it under control. Isn't that what I just did? Right? So we look at the next slide, and what we understand is that there are health risks associated to addiction. And we're going to start with the very first thing, and that is alcohol. And alcohol has definitely weaved its way into our culture. In fact, I like to be outdoors and I like to do outdoor things. And I find that if I sit down and watch television for any period of time, regardless of really what program I'm watching, I'll find that the alcohol companies have really solicited to the outdoor community. A perfect example of that is if I am watching bicycle racing on TV, the Tour de France, and I want to watch it for any period of time, I'm going to see an alcohol commercial, very specifically one that has an ultralight beer, talking to me about how that is the beer for active people. And it's a great commercial. I laugh every time I see it. But the problem is that alcohol does not have to find its way into every part of our culture. And so we look at this and we understand that this has happened. And so I just simply want you to understand some statistics. First of all, 51.5% of Americans consume alcohol regularly. Now, that doesn't sound so bad, because we think about that and we think, well, they're not going out and getting drunk every night. And you're right, they're not. But they are consuming alcohol regularly. And so we have to understand that that plays a role in their health and what's going to happen tomorrow with their health. The next statement is alcohol on campus. Right now, it is the most popular drug on campus. And I did classify that as a drug because that is what our textbook and several government agencies do classify it as. The next thing there is binge drinking. Binge drinking is a very serious issue. And what you can identify with is that binge drinking is someone who will go out and they will drink a lot for the simple reason to get drunk. And you may know people like this, but this is something that we know and associate with very poor behaviors. And it also increases risks for other poor behaviors. So there's one last one there, pre-gaming. And pre-gaming is simply saying, listen, before I go out to drink, I'm going to drink a lot at home, or before this certain event, or before this certain social event occurs. And we kind of end up taking in too much. And there are risks associated with that as well. But, it's all in the name of fun in some cases. But what we know is that there are so many risks involved that we have to educate you, the consumer, about what those risks are. And that's what the focus of this talk is. So alcohol does profoundly affect your body. And the one way we know that is because we can measure that through a blood alcohol content. And this is something that you probably already know a lot about, not from experience, but just from other classes and your own health education. But your blood alcohol content is a very unique thing about how much alcohol you consumed, and is what is in your blood. And it tells us a lot about how you are affected if you consume alcohol. There are short-term effects, there are long-term effects. You're probably very familiar with the short-term effects. First of all, the nervous system. And I would ask that you would join me over on page 421 and 422. This is where we will find most of those short-term effects. So first of all, the nervous system is affected by short-term alcohol use in that it depresses our nervous system. And many times we think, well, if I drink, I kind of get happy. And so it must not be a depressant, it must be a stimulant. But that is a very temporary thing too, in that it doesn't last very long. If you drink a lot of alcohol, you're going to get very tired and sleepy. And so that tells us about its depressant capabilities. The other side of this is, what does it do to your cardiovascular system? Well, if you look on page 422, you find that it slows your breathing, it decreases your pulse rate. And in a lot of ways, you think, hey, again, that's not a bad thing, but it's a depressant. And this is not something that we can do regularly and expect good results from, because there is a certain sequence that your heart rate as well as your respiration rate want to use so that you have maximal or optimal health. The next one on my list is my urinary system is going to be affected if I drink a lot of alcohol. And that's a pretty simple one. If you drink a lot of alcohol, you go to the bathroom a lot. Because alcohol is a diuretic, though, it is evacuating all of the water out of your body, because your body is trying to get that alcohol out. That's the way it responds to alcohol intake. Next one on my list is your sexual function and your sexual health are affected, primarily because what we know is that high intakes of alcohol in the short term cause a loss of libido and possibly even temporary impotence. And so that can affect a person's sexual health in a lot of ways, right? Last thing, and probably the most commonly reported, is that of a hangover. And we all know what a hangover is. That's that bad headache, that's the dizziness, the vomiting, the fatigue, the inability to eat or drink fluids for the next 12 to 24 hours. And there's just not a good fix for this. I mean, you're going to see on the internet that there is, but the reality is there's not. And I would tell you that this is someplace you just don't want to be, because it's going to take out, like I said, 12 to 24 hours of your day. Next thing, your long-term effects. I'll let you go through some of those specifically when it comes to the nervous system. But if you look on page 423, what you see are long-term effects specifically about brain size. We know that the brain does decrease in size over long-term usage of alcohol. The cardiovascular system is right there, and it says that it will give us an increased risk of high blood pressure. Well, that hypertension, and you know what things come with hypertension because we studied that all through chapter 10. But there you go. There's some proof that says, hey, look, if you're going to drink for a long time, you need to expect hypertension. And then an increased heart rate. Well, if you double high blood pressure and an increased heart rate, you're really looking for the potential of stroke, as well as heart attack and other cardiovascular diseases to come about. So this is something that we know happens. And then the very next thing on your long-term effects are liver. We know that cirrhosis is a very real thing. In fact, there was a young man who died of cirrhosis who was 35 just last year, and he's a local guy, and I was really surprised to hear this, but then I found out that he had a long-term addiction to alcohol. And then the last thing is cancer. What we know is that cancer does increase, or the risk of cancer does increase. And on page 423, it talks about how alcohol is considered a carcinogen, and that again is a cancer-causing agent. Next thing on my list is learning to drink responsibly on page 426. And so when I look over on page 426, it talks about some very unique things that we can do to help drink responsibly. First of all, it says to eat. If you consume food, you're going to respond differently than if you have an empty stomach and then you drink. Another thing is it says, do not drink before a party or event, and that's that pre-gaming concept and staying away from that. Another one I want to point out to you is pacing yourself. A lot of people don't really think about, drinking 1 drink per hour, and that stays pretty safe. Anything above that is where you start to see risk. There's risk in all of it, but I would tell you that if you can keep it down to 1 per hour and then you alternate with a little bit of water, you're at better odds of staying sober, at least to the point where you won't make bad choices. And then the last thing, don't drink and drive. And this is so true. And we kind of say this, we hear this, but yet, you know what, it happens. And chances are you've experienced this in your own way, where you've had a drink and you've possibly driven. And I hope that's not the case. And I hope that you don't do that in the future. But we know that this still does happen because we still have DUIs and DWIs. We still have people who are killed because of drunk drivers. And so this is still happening. So one of the things that I would leave you with here is to consider, if you're going to drink, do you have a plan on how you can be responsible with your drinking? My next slide is about the risks of tobacco. And so we're talking about tobacco in mostly a smoking tobacco format. There are a lot of talks we could have about smokeless tobacco. I'm going to spend most of my time here on smoking tobacco, specifically smoking cigarettes. But smoking on campus has actually declined, and I'm talking about college campuses, has actually declined in the last few years. We've seen a decrease in it. So what we know is that possibly college students, being that they are exposed to different information, new information, statistics, just like this class, have taught college students that there is so much risk associated with smoking that they're decreasing that risk. And so that's a good thing. The next thing that it says, though, is tobacco products are harmful substances. And on page 427, it will tell you that 80% of all lung cancer cases come from smoking. And I would tell you that that's a lot of lung cancer cases. But we also know that a lot of those people die. And so if that is true, lung cancer is the largest killer, right? Do you remember that from chapter 12? Well, then now what we know is that mostly comes from smoking. The nicotine and the carbon monoxide are two different chemicals that we want to talk about. First of all, nicotine is the addictive substance within smoking. And then carbon monoxide is that very lethal gas that is released from the smoke or the secondhand smoke. And so if you've been exposed to secondhand smoke, maybe your parents both smoked in your home and you were exposed to it your whole life, and now you don't smoke, what you need to understand is that you still have a higher risk of lung cancer just simply because of that carbon monoxide and how lethal it was. Short-term effects, page 428. I want you to look over on page 428, and I want you to understand that there are a lot of short-term effects that happen. First of all, lightheadedness. It kills your appetite, which some of you are like, that's exactly why I smoke, because it keeps me thin. But what you have to understand is the risk is far worse than the benefit. You can do other things to keep you thin or depressed or take care of your appetite, self-control one. But the other side of this is you have to think about the other issues and risks out there. I would also point out that we see an increased respiratory rate, an increased heart rate or blood pressure rate. And so we see these things coming up, and as they go long term, because people rarely smoke 1 cigarette a week, or we may have 1 drink a week, but we rarely have 1 smoke a week. If they're smoking several cigarettes a day. And so what we see is this pattern increase over the years and cause that increased respiration rate, that increased pulse rate, and then we see that increased blood pressure. And so again, that word atherosclerosis, that hardening of the arteries, here it comes again. And when that happens, you know the rest of the story by now. But then we go back to the long-term effects. Number one is addiction, and we know that there are negative consequences tied to addiction. Number two is it increases the risks of oral cancers and diseases. It increases the risk of lung cancer as well as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, that's COPD, that's emphysema, that's chronic bronchitis. Those are two of the most common linked diseases with smoking. And then I also would point out that we see increased kidney, bladder, pancreatic cancers attached to smoking as well. So those are not good things. And these are the things that we want to point out to you and say, listen, we don't want these to happen. Let me go into here, drug abuse and misuse. So misuse is simply that of I've got these drugs like, Benadryl or NyQuil, and I don't really have a cold, I don't really have an allergy, but I need something to help me sleep. And I'm picking on myself here because I've done that. I've misused NyQuil and Benadryl. But what I would tell you is that there's a lot of other drugs that are misused, more serious drugs, opioids, because when people develop an opioid dependence in as little as 5 days, then that's a very serious addiction that they can have. And so the risk is there. And how many people do you know get opioids, which are pain controlling medications, after having an injury? And maybe their prescription goes on for 2 weeks. So that addiction and that dependence can become very real, very quick. Drug abuse is that of the fact that we are abusing a drug, a known drug, very specifically not just opioids, but also marijuana. We're talking about methamphetamines. We're talking about things that most people in daily life never even see, like cocaine. So these are the things that we know happen, and they become abused, and that's where the addiction is so real, and those negative consequences come back. Now, I have picked out 3 that I want to talk about specific today. Number 1 is marijuana. This is the number 1 abused drug on college campuses. And so we see definitely the fact that alcohol is the largest used drug, smoking number 2, and then marijuana number 3. So what we know is that marijuana is very real on college campuses. Most of you have probably seen, heard, smelled, maybe even used it. But what we know are the risks involved from that. And you can go in and you can say, listen, it would not give me any risk to use another drug. But that is just counter to the wealth of data and research that is out there that's saying, no, it is a gateway drug. And so to avoid the potential risk of a gateway drug, we would ask that you would consider not using marijuana just for the simple risk of decreasing that. Now, there's another one, and that is methamphetamines and stimulants. And methamphetamine is just one form of a stimulant. Another stimulant that is very well known are certain drugs that contain caffeine, or caffeine in and of itself. I would also offer that certain prescription drugs like Adderall, which is used to control or treat, I should say, ADHD and ADD, is a stimulant. It's also a very heavily watched substance. And to get that, you have to do quite a few things, like get a paper prescription every month just to get your refill. And then the third one on our list is anabolic steroids. And I bring this one out there because it is such a common thing, especially in the fitness world. And this is all about getting fit and staying well. And it's very tempting to us who are in the fitness world to go out there and use one drug and some syringes to really increase and enhance our performance. So much so that you see it in professional sports all the time. And so these are very real as well. And they're not very hard to get to. In fact, I would say these are easier to get than probably the other 2 that are on our list. But the reality is we have to be aware of what those risks are. I'm going to give you a chance to go through the book, think about these things, go through chapter 13 labs, do the one of choice, and understand what it is that those risks are. And I hope that you take a very serious consideration to what these risks and their long-term effects are. If you have any questions, please don't forget to email me. My office is always open. Love to see you come by. And if you have any questions, call or email. See ya.